All right, I'm here. Now beyond Intendal, Sasha. Anybody else coming? Was Merwin going to be available or Wayne?
Uh, he's not available.
Okay. Um, Sounds good. Most of the comments were from him on some of these concepts, like the additional input for the task and the step and the status. So, Nick and Nalbion, what do y'all think about? I guess we could go from the top down, actually.
Yeah, let's go from top down. I can also share a little bit from his perspective. I went and chatted with him for like 8 minutes, and I tried to understand what his perspective is, and I can share what I've learned with you guys as well. Yeah.
Okay. So, we are discussing some few small changes to the spec. Um, the first proposal is changing the current agent protocol repo to the spec repo. So that's where we separate the repositories up so that we're dealing with only a repo that has the spec repo, a separate repo for the docs site itself, and then any other tools or things that we create that'll be separated. Do we want to implement a CLI? And if so, it should be in its own repository. Do we have the resources to build the CLI before September 22nd? I believe yes, most likely. It would be very basic, but considering the simplicity of using a CLI to just at least list tasks and view them, then it should be pretty straightforward to get something set up. It wouldn't be a full testing suite. There wouldn't be a lot of uh, stuff there, but it should be very quick to get something like that set up. And we can look at that this next week. Um, is there anything that anybody
So,
wants to
so for the
see
CLI
specifically?
capability you mentioned, so for CLI capability you mentioned that it won't be the full testing suite. Would it be similar to kind of what we discussed yesterday? It's kind of like a CLI tool example, like what Nick has kind of commented in the doc, where we, provide a example input. For example,
This
write the word
this example down
Washington in
here.
the file.
Right. So with this,
Yeah.
this is not actually the one that I was thinking of creating. What I wanted to create was something a bit closer to like Docker, where you have Docker images ls or something like that. Except instead of that, it would be agent tasks ls or something along those lines. And then so if you wanted to create another task, then you could do agent task create, input equals or something along those lines. But I'm not sure that that's the what we need as much as this. Although with this, what I've been working on is getting that testing suite ready that we had talked about. Merwain's original testing suite based on Alan's code that uses Newman to run a pre-trained test or pre-configured test against the model. The only thing with that is that it's currently set up for zero point 0.4. So if we add the the schema that we were talking about, where it has slash AP slash V1, etc., then some of those routes need to be changed, but that shouldn't be too difficult. So with this, the only thing that I was going to, this is what I was talking about, where we basically just take that script that he has, and instead of having uh, the the task that he's written in there, we just replace it with whatever the input is. And I think this particular example could be using that script easily. As far as a separate application built in a specific language instead of using the dependencies, that's probably something else because um, it's I would say it's a bit more difficult to dynamically give it an input and expect a specific output. Although maybe not.
In in that example, is the this is because there's only one input. This is creating the task, right?
Right.
So how like there's no output field in the task, create task response.
Um, like for creating a task you're talking
Concurrently,
about?
all the task does is to create a container
The example wasn't
and
designed for
provides no output.
the example wasn't designed for that level of correctness. It was just that was ancillary to a different discussion about how certain things should work. So
I think one
if
of
the
the
example
things
itself is flawed, don't worry about it.
Yeah.
I think one of the things here too is that we are confusing a CLI tool with a CLI like suite, you know, and that's kind of I think the difference is what Merwin was talking
So
about.
what do you see the unless my interpretation is wrong, what would you see the post
The purpose?
like the network traffic would look like for this CLI example?
I think the CLI would just be a CLI client for the agent protocol, right? Am I crazy here?
Yes, it's basically just a client that would let you, you know, list the tasks that are there, create new tasks or create new steps, see the all the steps that are in there, and browse through it that way. Because my thought here with the creating a CLI client like that is that it's also relatively easy to build a UI on top of a CLI where it's using that CLI in the background of it, so that whenever you know we get a user interface up, then you can go through tasks and look at things, and that's all being built on top of that CLI app. Um, do you
So
think
I
that
will
that
say AutoGPT is putting a pretty significant amount of resources into building a UI already. So
Yeah.
I would probably not work to replicate that too much if we're trying not to like spread ourselves too thin. Right?
right
We're going to be building a UI for the agent protocol already.
right
So I wouldn't try and build something that's necessarily UI friendly. And I understand that's like maybe represents a little bit of a conflict of interest, but I just don't want us to spend our time early on things that are quite challenging,
right
right?
and that was one of the
Already being
things
done.
was the overall priority for it wasn't that high. It wasn't really something that I was planning on doing before this hackathon started, and after that then working on something along those lines. The biggest thing right now is just sort of making the repository for the agent protocol leaner, coming up with a version 1 standard, you know, that we can say this is it right here, got to use this, you know, and then making sure that the documentation works and that we're linking off to anything that's using the agent protocol and stuff like that, which will probably edit as more things adopt the agent protocol, so that there's more reference examples and implementations of it, right?
Yeah, for sure. So let's take this from the top of the to-do list you had. I think we had a couple of things to come to consensus on. The first, I think, was separating out the repos.
Yes.
Can we go through that list again and just quickly?
You cut out a little bit at the end there, but yeah. So, can you hear me, Nick?
Yep, I can hear you
Okay.
fine. Sorry, my audio quality's trash.
Oh, it's no problem.
I can hear you. You can't hear me.
Gotcha. So, yes, we're going to be adding the Agent Protocol docs site, the Next.js documentation site, the agentprotocol.ai. That's going to go into its own repo. We're going to probably move certain things into a separate repository for more notes-based, consistent work things that we're doing. The reference that we have here is for like GraphQL or middle click doesn't work on here. It's a control click, isn't it? There we go. So GraphQL, when they have a separate repository for their, they call it the working group notes. And so they have this folder where they have, you know, notes and membership and agendas, tools and RFCs. And so what we'll probably do is move the RFCs from the spec page into this separate repository, so that things are over there, along with probably more looser information that we're able to share between us, that we can have, like, instead of a Google Doc, we could have these notes inside of that repository or something along those lines as well. And then the other thing was this was a task C for that was implementing a CLI and how we would structure that. And so instead of putting it into a mono repo with the spec, then it would go into its own separate repo underneath the AI Engineer Foundation group in GitHub. I think that was the only other bit there, is just making sure things are separated. So at the end of it, the only thing that should exist in the spec repository is the spec. And then the only thing that would exist in the docs repository are things related to the docs. And one of the things that's going to go into the docs is probably also the testing suite right now, because that's added as an example implementation of a testing suite, because it is a bit opinionated, so we will want to make sure that people know that it's opinionated so that they can take it and they can create their own or see what that process looks like. So I'm also working on the Agent Protocol docs site right now to get it to fit that description. And I think that's it. Was there anything else?
Yeah, just curious how if people are generally supportive of the proposal that we have here, which is separating out the spec with the doc, and as well as kind of like a working group / community repo.
Yeah, I support that. I think it's
Great.
kind of confusing right now to have all these things tied together. And making changes to one requires changes to the others, which feels weird. My only concern is making sure we synchronize the docs and the spec changes.
Mono repos cause mono problems.
Yeah. But yeah, we can have CI triggers and stuff to trigger doc rebuilds whenever we merge into the spec repo.
Yes. And I'm also on board for that. I think it makes sense in general. Nalbion, what do you think about any of that? All right. That one's a go. The second one
All right.
was,
Propose-
oh, go ahead.
Oh, no, you go ahead. I'm just saying should move on to the
Oh.
next one.
So the second one was removing additional input for both task and step. And the reasoning behind this was that we wanted to try and push towards creating an API that's a natural language NLP, or I think Lane was calling it NLPify, where we remove the extra data that we're adding into these things and just keeping it straight as an input. And he wanted to remove it for both a step and for the task. And so whenever you would create a task, instead of giving that task an input, you would only be giving the task, well, nothing. It would just create a task. So you would post an empty body essentially. And the note here, very spicy take, very ideal in theory. We may not be able to support some agents because of this. And I partially agree and I partially disagree. I'm kind of in the middle.
I also want to give some context. Right. Wait, I think there's a lag, so sorry to interjecting.
Oh, you're good. Yeah, you're good. Go ahead. I don't think you're lagging. Am I lagging?
Okay. So there are kind of two principles that I'm thinking about. One is we should, as an organization, implement the minimum viable set of features for people, and then people can, if they wish, people can like fork and add additional features. So that's one principle. And the other principle is maybe what we should do is to operate in a realm that allows that's the most lenient, so that it allows for the most number of agents using this protocol. And that way we can kind of like, we don't have to decide for them. We can see what the community kind of gravitate towards, and in terms of like operating. Sorry, let me go back to the first point. I think the first point, rather than saying that we should let them fork it, because forking it kind of defeats the purpose, I more mean like the plugin system. Building a plugin system so that people can like extend on top of the existing agent protocol. So I'm curious to hear from the people here, between these two principles, what are we feeling? And I mean, they're not directly like contradictory in some ways. So curious to hear.
So I have opinions. First and foremost, what do you imagine the additional input is used for? Right.
So okay. So So right now the agent API is kind of like agent protocol API is kind of like just the interface. So the person that's calling the agent interface could be either an agent or it could be a human, a client, right? And if it is being called by another agent, and if the person, let's say, controls both agents, there may be parameters that needs to be passed from one agent to another to configure the second agent in some way. So allowing additional input is basically saying, execute this task with these additional configuration. Now, there is some debate within the community saying that agent-to-agent communication should just be text and it shouldn't have additional configuration. It's kind of like a philosophical, like morality debate. And I don't know, I feel like I could be convinced that this is the approach that we want to go. We just be very deterministic about what the interface should look like. But I could be convinced the other way too, like we should allow the interface to be so versatile that it serves the most number of agents and then let the community decide. Yeah.
So my opinion on this is kind of maybe different. I would use this for stuff like, hey, I want to use GPT 3.5 or GPT 4, right? Like that's the kind of things I would expect this to be used for. And that, in my opinion, doesn't make sense necessarily as additional input, the word, but maybe as configuration, right? And this is where the info endpoint comes in useful, right? And you could have a configuration options endpoint that says, here are your configuration options. I don't think you should take additional input to be interpreted in that way, right? So I think this field should be renamed configuration and still be optional. But if you use this field, you must report it on the info endpoint what configuration options are valid.
Now, that's for the additional info on the task, right? Or additional input on the task. What about on the step?
On a step, I can also see that being useful. Less so, though.
Because it probably wouldn't have the same structure, right?
Right.
Or actually, think that another idea was removing it from the task, but keeping it on the step or something along those lines.
Compliance.
Sorry, what?
One more time. I'm sorry, you're cutting out. Can you repeat yourself? I don't know.
So automated machine to machine kind of transactions. I think the additional input could contain a whole like range of stuff where to provide context around what the message is. You could have like different task and step types. You could have credentials like and configuration options as you mentioned. Also, the client's ID or name might impact the way that the agent handles the request.
It might. You're saying like if there was multiple clients, then that could affect the way that the agent responds to the client, and then potentially also different types of steps and different types of tasks that would be specified via the config that's given as part of the input. I think that one of the issues with that is that it's broadening it up. I don't know. What do you think about it, Sasha?
I heard Nick's comment on having a general config endpoint. and like from like the agent perspective, sharing with the client what config is support. But I feel like the way I see it is kind of more like high level, where it's like, you know, maybe like of all the calls that you make to the agent, we support, you know, GPT-4, GPT 3.5, and that's it. Whereas like the additional input is kind of like more on task level or step level, right? So if you like, let's say for this task, I want to use, let's say GPT-4. For the other task, I want to use GPT 3.5. So the additional input just allows more kind of finer grain control for each execution. I couldn't really hear Nalbion's point. If you could kind of
He's putting it
maybe just
into
like
the lounge
chat.
text chat. Yeah.
Okay, sounds good. But yeah, Nick, what do you think about what I was saying? One is more kind of fine grained level, and the other is kind of like global.
Yeah, exactly. For example, I'm going to use AutoGPT as an example here. But at a request level, theoretically, we could toggle what LLM you're using, right? Or what image generator you're using, right? Like we support 4 different text to speech. This is a bad example because your agent wouldn't be doing text to speech in this case, but 4 different text to speech options, right? And you could use that configuration to choose which one. Or we could support multiple different image generation. That's probably a better example. And then you could say, hey, I want to use Dolly, or I want to use Stable Diffusion, or whatever, in those configuration options. And they would apply both on a step level and on a like task level, right? So you'd set your globals with your task, and those are like your defaults. And then you would override them necessarily or provide more if needed. And I will say this would address one of the concerns we're having with I need a way to configure the agent from the front end without recompiling the agent.
Right. Because right now you have to give it a command line argument, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So I think that sounds good because we were talking about creating an info endpoint. Now, in the context of additional input, here we're talking about 2 different types, task and step. The idea was to before to just remove input and additional input from task, leave task as an empty object with a ID and a timestamp, and create steps underneath that. Do you think that that would work out well? And then we could have that globalized config for the additional input in the steps, completely removing anything from the task except for a collection of steps and artifacts?
I would have to see the proposal to say whether or not that's a good idea.
I think that was in here. Well, it was just remove additional input for both task and step. And I think that was, yeah. I can type it out real quick.
That would be super awesome because that was kind of hard for me to visualize.
Removing input and additional input from tasks. So tasks would have the request body of just an empty object, and they would contain a UUID, a timestamp, as they do, and then a list of steps and a list of artifacts. There would be no input on the task. There would be no there'd be no label for the tasks per se. The labeling would be up to the client.
What endpoint would this be on? Post or Get?
Both. The input would be completely removed from a task object.
How would I tell a task what I want it to do?
So the task, I think the idea there is that the steps are what does something, and the task just contains the steps and the artifacts. That's why removing the input from the task, because the idea was, why are we posting the input twice? Why are we posting the input to a task? What is the task doing before it does the step, right? Because if you post the task and then you post the step, and they both have the same input, what does that mean?
In my opinion, step doesn't require an input. So
Right. Okay.
Having task return the first step would probably be a better idea, frankly.
Yeah. I think one of the concepts there was in a REST API, when you call a specific resource, you don't want it to return multiple separate resources. You want it to be sort of a granular approach. But I'm I'm up for either way. I think you're right that the input should be able to be empty on a step, so then task should keep it. So then we're just but removing additional input from the task, or would a task additional input be the default for the task or something along those lines? If it's a config.
Additional input would be converted to a configuration.
Right. And so then you could give it as to the task as the default for all of the steps under it, but then also give it to the steps as a change it for just this step kind of thing. And then
and like the concept of additional input would be dropped in favor of better wording.
Config.
Right.
Yeah.
Because I feel like people think additional input is like, oh, I also want to say these things, and it's like, no.
Right.
Right.
They see it sort of like the system prompt for ChatGPT right now. I think is what a lot of people kind of thought. But it's supposed to be.
And that's not really the intention.
What do you think about that, Sasha?
I am in favor of this idea.
All right.
Would you mind writing that down so we can all agree on a little interface for it?
Yes.
I know that's like difficult, but not difficult, but like tedious.
I can do it. I can do it. And then I feel like Zane suggested another thing, which is to remove the input for task. And I feel like that's a separate proposal almost. And so,
it is, yeah.
So let's just keep unless people feel very strongly that we should remove. Like I have never thought of removing the input for task. I think the input for task is still super valuable. I think let's just keep the discussion to the doc.
Okay. I'll flesh that out later. Yes. So the other thing was versioning. We had talked about creating this structure where we had /AP/version and then /agent instead of just doing /agent, and then we would enforce it all the way up to the host name. So instead of being able to have, my website or my backend site / whatever I want /agent, it would be enforced all the way to that root host name and port. What do you think about that, Nick?
I think we should do that. Frankly, just because it's easier to have a stable endpoint, and if we're namespacing the entire thing, I feel less guilty.
Yeah.
Right. Like, if we're namespacing everything behind AP, I'm fine doing it. If we were not doing that, it'd be a little more difficult. But the only restriction in place on that is we cannot require any endpoints outside of /AP.
Okay. And then as for versioning for the numbers, it was suggested that maybe we keep it to integers at like V1 and V2 instead of V1.0 and V1.1 or anything like that. You think it should be V1 and then V2?
I do agree with that, because parsing URLs can go sideways when you start including periods in them.
Okay.
For steps, yes, but for tasks, no.
Say that again, Albion.
For steps, they can be integers. For tasks, I think integers. I mean, strings is more useful for me.
So we're talking about the version for the API, right? So version 1 versus version 1, like integer, versus version 1.0.0. 0, whatever. I don't know how many zeros we need.
Yeah, integers better.
Yeah. Just because things are going to go sideways. Also, we shouldn't be doing minor releases of version APIs.
Right.
Like, it's going to be a fucking nightmare. Sorry, that's going to be a nightmare for devs to handle if we're doing minor version releases.
Okay. Sasha?
Yeah, sounds good. It sounds like everyone agrees on just an integer. I would prior to this conversation, I was thinking I don't think it's too much work to add the point like 1.0, but I want to kind of I don't feel very strongly about that, and so I'm happy to go with what people prefer.
Me too.
I would love to talk about that.
I think. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
So the reason I don't think like the 0.0 is a good idea is because, well, okay, hear me out. Saying I support version greater than 1.0 is pretty easy, right? Or saying I support version 1, version 2. My concern and why I kind of am swaying towards your side now is let's say we add to the protocol without breaking backwards compatibility, right?
Yeah.
That's where a 1.5 is super helpful.
Right.
Um,
Well, and an idea too was to and make it so that it could be made into just v1. But if it's actually the URL parsing that's the issue, then that definitely complicates things. The yeah, it's a
Right.
tough
How
spot.
how much of a just so that I understand how much of a URL parsing like by introducing a dot, like how much of an issue would that be? Like I have never really personally felt that there are issues in my professional career. So
Yeah, so my concern is host names and the spec around them is kind of wild. I don't know if y'all have ever read it. I was a DevOps engineer once upon a time who worked with IoT devices that were not super compliant, like, and they would basically just break if you got into any of these weird edge cases, which is like a period at the end of a URL, right? Like,
Yeah.
an example of that would be Google Domains recently published a .zip domain, right, which is also a valid file ending.
Right.
Stuff like that broke systems that I can't say.
so can we, instead of doing like 1.0, we can also 1.5, we can do 1/5, not slash, dash, 1 dash.
That would
Would
work
that
great.
be
Yep, that works great for me.
okay? So just
Dash
keep it
no significance is part of it.
two numbers, one
Yep.
dash something. But will we be doing something that's like special, like that nobody? What does other people do? I'm just curious. I don't want to do something like that's
Whole
too
numbers as far
special.
as I've seen.
Oh, just whole numbers.
Yeah, because a router for that would kind of be weird, but like it's possible in every language because they're just strings. I wouldn't worry about it too much.
Maybe we should just do what other people do. I feel like the actually maybe let's add a to-do step to kind of do some research instead of deciding in this meeting.
Yeah.
Figure out what popular endpoints, how popular endpoint versioning work, right?
Yeah.
Okay. And so lastly, we kind of this is just so that we are on the same page. We discussed this in the channel, in the agent protocol channel of what we agreed on, which is the endpoint is going to look something like this, where we have HTTPS and like, let's say Amazon EC2 link of some agent endpoint. This is a / right? /AP, which stands for agent protocol. And / v1 stands for agent protocol versioning, / agent, / tasks. So this is kind of like the tasks API. And then we provide you can provide a task ID and then / steps and step ID. That's kind of what the URL structure look like. And then secondly, we're going to add an info endpoint. And so all of these will be inside of the September, before the September 20 version 1.0 release. And so this is just to make sure we're all on the same page.
I agree with
Sounds
that.
good?
It sounds good to me. that structure looks great.
Cool. So we have one to do here, and happy to do some research with Zane here to figure out, and then we'll post the follow-up results into the channel in the agent protocol. Cool.
Yep.
Anything else, anyone?
Not from my end. There was that was pretty much it. Working on the doc site, working on the testing suite, and splitting the repos are the biggest things. Changing the spec ever so slightly to just add the info endpoint to add this new structure that we talked about, and then getting the additional input, changing that to config. I think that pretty much wraps up everything we talked about, if I'm not mistaken. So
yeah, and we should keep a close contact with our integration partners. So AutoGPT being one example, Small Developer another example, all of the people that are building agents that we serve, and make sure that they, when we release the 1.0 release, they should like do some minor changes to be compliant as well.
Yeah, I think GPT Pilot's also one that's working on that use case as well.
Okay.
So we should keep that in mind.
GPT Pilot. Okay.
Yeah, the
I did
LinkedIn
see
chat,
that.
as well as GPT Engineer. I think Marwan has a better list, or Wayne, I guess. I don't. We're not gonna get into that right now. He has a better list
Sounds
than I do.
good.
Cool.
But we should keep in mind and maybe set up a mailing
yeah.
list for those people.
Okay, mailing list. Yeah, to inform them of the changes. Sounds good. Okay, that's it. All right, thanks everyone for another great conversation.
Awesome.
All right.
Thanks, y'all.
Thank you.
Thanks.